Hey guys, this week we're going to be talking about respiration. So the main function of the respiratory system, the lungs, and then we're going to lump the vessels into this, is gas exchange. So for the most part, we're talking about the transport of oxygen to cells in the body so that they can use it for metabolism, and then transporting metabolites such as CO2 away from the cells so that they continue to function. So O2 is going to cells, CO2 is going away from cells. So inside of our lungs, we have these little sacs called alveoli, which are the main sites of gas exchange. So our alveoli are the sites of gas exchange. Inside of our alveoli, we have two types of alveolar cells. We have type 1 cells. These make up most of the cells that we have inside of our alveoli, and these are where gas exchange actually happens. So type 1, we have gas exchange. Type 2 alveolar cells produce this special fluid called surfactant. Surfactant decreases surface tension in alveolar cells and in the lungs in general so that they can continue to function. Type 2 cells produce surfactant, and this decreases surface tension. If surface tension in the lungs got too high, they might collapse and then the lungs wouldn't be able to perform their function of gas exchange. So on this side, we have a little diagram of the lungs, and we're going to go through what the different membranes are and what everything is in this diagram. So we'll start here. This is the lung itself. So these on either side are the lungs, lung space, whatever you want to call it. In between these two membranes here, we have the interpleural space because these are two pleura that we have surrounding the lungs. So in between, interpleural space. Outside of the two pleura, we have the chest wall. Sorry, my brother's walking through. It's fine. We're just gonna... So on this side of the board, we have a diagram of the lungs. We're gonna go through what all of these membranes are and what everything's referring to. There's something you should have a general idea of. So when we discuss the pressures in the lungs, you know what we're talking about. So the outside membrane that's closer to the chest wall is called the parietal pleura. And the one here that's closer to the inside of the lung is called the visceral pleura. And in between the two pleura, visceral and parietal, we have what's known as the interpleural or intrapleural, both mean the same thing, space. So this here is the interpleural space. Interpleural space. And then of course inside all of these we have the lung. This is the heart. Then outside of the lung itself we have the chest wall, which separates the lungs from the rest of the chest. And finally, down here, below the lungs and the heart, we have the diaphragm, which acts both as a muscle and to separate the lungs from the abdominal cavity. So, just a brief review, we went over what the alveoli are, the two types of cells in the alveoli, and then the structure of the lungs. Now we're going to talk about the different pressures in the lung and how these relate to inspiration and expiration, so how they relate to breathing. So in the lung, as we discussed before, we have the visceral pleura, the parietal pleura, the interpleural space, the inside of the lung, and then outside, which here we're going to refer to as the atmosphere. So we're going to go through what the different pressures are along these membranes. So inside of the lung, we have the alveolar pressure, because this is the pressure inside of our alveoli. So here we're going to call this P alveolar pressure, P alveoli. Between the two pleura, the visceral and the parietal, we call this the interpleural pressure. And then outside of the lungs, we call this the atmospheric pressure, because once you leave the respiratory tract, you're now in the atmosphere. So P, ATM is out here. Then we're going to look at the pressures between different membranes. So we're going to look at the pressure between the inside of the lung and the interpleural space. This is called transpleural pressure, or PTP. PTP. And then between the interpleural space and the atmosphere, we call this the chest wall pressure, or PCW. So quick recap, this is a diagram of the lung, very simple, and it shows you what the different pressures are that we're going to be looking at on this graph right here. So coming over to this graph, this shows you the different pressures and volumes inside of the lung as we go through one breath cycle. So on this side over here, we're looking at what happens to our pressures during inspiration. And then on the right, we're looking at what happens inside of our lungs during expiration. So this top pressure here is the transpleural pressure, so PTP. The one in the middle here that goes down and then back up is the alveolar pressure, so P alveolar. On the bottom, we have the interpleural pressure, PIP, and the bottom here is just the volume of the lung. Lung volume. One thing to note about this is that right here, through the middle of, just gonna redraw that real quick so that it's more to scale. This line right here represents atmospheric pressure. So this right here is PATM. And as you can see, that's where our alveolar pressure starts at the beginning of a breath and ends at the end of a breath. So what happens during inspiration? As you can see on the left side here, for inspiration, we're going to see our transpleural pressure increase. Our alveolar pressure is going to decrease. And we're also going to see a decrease in our interpleural pressure, but we call this becoming more negative because relative to the atmospheric pressure, our interpleural pressure is always negative, but as we inspire, this pressure becomes more negative than it was before. Interpleural pressure decreases. How do we get that to happen? So one way that this happens is our diaphragm contracts. When our diaphragm contracts, it goes down, kind of contrary to how you would think muscles contract. But in the case of the diaphragm, it contracts down. When it does this, it causes the lungs to pull down with it, which then causes this drastic decrease in alveolar pressure. And as we remember, things in physiological systems go from concentrations of high to low. In this case, we're talking about pressures, but the concept is the same. Air is going to go from high pressure to low pressure. When we see that the atmospheric pressure is above the alveolar pressure, we know that the air is going to go from the atmosphere into our lungs. So going back to what I was saying in the beginning, our diaphragm is going to contract. And not just our diaphragm, but our external intercostals. So these are the muscles on the outside of our ribs. When they contract, they also pull our rib cage outwards, which causes, again, this decrease in alveolar pressure. So we get the same result as diaphragm contraction. So then just a brief recap of inspiration. We have an increase in our transpleural pressure. We get a decrease in alveolar pressure as it drops below atmospheric pressure. Air rushes into the lungs because it goes from areas of high pressure to areas of low pressure, which is why we get this increase in lung volume as air enters the lung. And we're going to get a relative decrease in interpleural pressure as it becomes more negative relative to atmospheric pressure. So air enters the lung. For the most part, expiration is going to be the opposite. So if you look on the right side over here, for expiration, our transpleural pressure is going to decrease. So the opposite of what happened during inspiration. We're going to get this increase in our alveolar pressure. It'll drop back down again, but the first thing that happens is we get an increase in alveolar pressure. Regardless, it's going to go above atmospheric pressure, and like we said before, things go from high pressure, high concentration to low pressure, low concentration. So as long as our alveolar pressure is above our atmospheric pressure, which we can see here, air is going to leave the lungs. So alveolar decreases, and our interpleural pressure is going to become less negative. We can also refer to that as increasing. Increases. Sorry, I wrote that as a decreasing. So in this case, our diaphragm is going to relax. When it contracted, it pulled our lungs down with it because of the pressure change. Now as it relaxes, it allows our lungs to relax too, so that our interpleural pressure can become less negative. For the most part, you won't see the action of any intercostal muscles. If you're forcefully expiring like this, you'll get the action of your internal intercostals. When your internal intercostals contract, they cause your rib cage to come in more quickly, so that forces the air to leave your lungs. Increases. Diaphragm relaxes. And air leaves the lungs. So in terms of this information, it's really important to understand how these pressures work together to get air to enter and leave the lungs, and to know what muscles are working alongside the pressure changes in order to get that to happen.